Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right into some sources you sent over, and today we're really focusing in on one key article.
Yeah, the one we're digging into is from Fintech Weekly. It's titled, SEC Drops Binance Case, Closing One of Its Final Major Crypto Lawsuits.
That's the one. So our mission here, based only on what this article is telling us, is to unpack this pretty big development, the SEC's lawsuit against Binance and its founder, Changpeng Zhao, getting formally dismissed.
And, the article makes it clear this wasn't just some minor case. It was really high profile.
Definitely.
And its ending, according to the source, sends a pretty strong signal, especially in the crypto world.
A signal that the article suggests isn't just about Binance, right? It might say something about, well, the bigger picture of regulation here in the U.S.
Exactly. The source kind of frames this specific dismissal as closing out a really significant enforcement action.
Okay, so let's unpack what this Fintech Weekly article actually lays out. We should look at, what this specific SEC case was about, how it officially ended, and crucially, what the article says this means for crypto and maybe U.S. regulation going forward.
All right, jumping in, the piece confirms it. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, has officially dismissed its lawsuit against Binance and Changpeng Zhao, or CZZ.
And the article gives a bit of detail. It wasn't just quietly dropped. It says the agency filed something called a joint stipulation with Binance.
A joint stipulation, which, well, in legal speak, and based on how the article describes it, that basically means both sides agreed to file something with the court saying, okay, we agree the SEC is voluntarily dropping these specific claims.
Right. It's like the formal paperwork to end that specific legal fight. And the source points out this case started back in 2023. And importantly, its dismissal closes out one of the most, let's say, prominent crypto enforcement actions that kicked off under the previous administration. The article even calls it a major symbol of the regulatory crackdown under the Biden-era SEC.
Now, here's something the article really stresses, and it's super important for understanding what this dismissal actually covers. This SEC case, it was totally separate from that other huge settlement.
The $4.3 billion, right?
Exactly. That massive settlement Binance and Zhao reached back in November 2023.
That's a really key distinction the article makes. So that bigger settlement, the source says, that dealt with criminal charges, civil actions from other agencies, like the Department of Justice, the CFTC.
Right.
But the SEC's own case focused on security stuff. That wasn't part of that deal.
Correct. The SEC, as the article lays it out, was pursuing its own thing, its own distinct claims, mostly alleging violations of securities laws related to how Binance operated and, the products it offered.
And what's kind of interesting about the timing reading the article is that the SEC apparently signaled this might be coming earlier this year, like back in February 2025.
Yeah, it notes the SEC had asked the court for a 60-day stay then, which in court terms, as the article kind of implies, is basically hitting pause on the case for a bit.
A temporary pause.
Exactly, essentially signaling they were likely, winding down their side of things.
So this formal dismissal, the joint stipulation filed recently, the article basically presents it as just finalizing what they signaled a few months back.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It just puts a formal end to the SEC's specific legal fight with Binance and CZ.
Okay. And the article, it puts this into a wider context, too. It highlights that this SEC case ending is happening as the regulatory landscape for cryptocurrency in the U.S. continues to shift.
It suggests that maybe the way agencies are enforcing rules, their priorities are being sort of reevaluated. Especially, it seems, because actual legislative proposals about crypto oversight are starting to get bipartisan traction in Congress. People on both sides are looking at it.
So this specific dismissal, it kind of begs the question the article asks, what does this one lawsuit going away actually mean overall?
Well, yeah. The source acknowledges other agencies, like the DOJ, are still involved in the space. But it argues that the SEC dropping this Binance case specifically removes one of the last major legal actions stemming from a broader push during the previous presidential term to regulate fintech and crypto.
Interesting. So let's talk about the implications the article mentions, because they could matter, well, everywhere, right? Binance is still huge globally. CZ is still a big name, even after stepping down as CEO.
For sure. The article states pretty clearly that resolving this specific SEC lawsuit reduces the ongoing legal risk facing the platform in the U.S.
Okay, that makes sense. Less legal trouble from the SEC specifically.
But, and this is an important but, the article adds, it doesn't mean Binance is totally off the hook. It says other regulatory and compliance obligations continue to apply.
Right, so not a complete wipe clean, But the article suggests a pretty significant, specific legal threat from the SEC, at least in the U.S., is now gone for Binance.
And the piece really emphasizes that people are watching this closely. The whole fintech sector, apparently.
Why is that, according to the source?
Because it's seen as particularly relevant for any digital asset company that's maybe thinking about coming into the U.S. market or, expanding their operations here.
Ah, okay. Because if such a big case is resolved.
Exactly. With that specific enforcement action off the table, the article suggests the focus is probably going to shift.
Shift to what?
According to the source, people will likely be looking more closely at the SEC's future approach under current leadership, and also how these ongoing regulatory reforms, probably meaning those legislative efforts, mentioned earlier, how they'll end up affecting big players, like institutional investors getting into crypto.
Okay. So if we sort of connect the dots the article gives us, you've got the specific case dismissal, the fact it was separate from the bigger settlement, the context of this shifting regulatory mood, plus Congress getting more involved.
Yeah, then this dismissal isn't just, one company's legal issue ending. The source frames it as maybe an indicator, a signpost, in a potentially changing U.S. approach to digital assets.
Absolutely. Makes sense when you put it all together like that. So let's try and pull together the main takeaways from this Fintech Weekly article then. First, the SEC's own separate lawsuit against Binance and Changpeng Zhao, which was distinct from that huge $4.3 billion settlement with other agencies that's now formally done with, dismissed via a joint agreement.
Right. And this move basically just finalizes what the SEC had already hinted at earlier this year. It closes out what the source called a really significant enforcement action from the previous administration's push.
And it removes a specific major legal risk for Binance in the U.S., although, as the article notes, other compliance duties definitely still remain.
Definitely. And importantly, the article situates this whole thing against a backdrop where the U.S. regulatory scene for crypto is seemingly in flux.
Yeah, the source says enforcement strategies are being relooked at, actual laws are getting debated more seriously in Congress.
And attention is turning to what the SEC does next and how any new rules or laws might impact, the bigger financial institutions getting involved in crypto.
And naturally, as the article points out, when a case this big gets resolved, everyone in the fintech world is watching, especially those companies maybe thinking about setting up shop or growing in the U.S.
Yeah, you can see why they'd be interested.
So thinking about all that, this major SEC case against Binance wrapping up, specifically happening while this article describes the regulatory environment as shifting and lawmakers showing more interest, what does this specific development, as laid out here, maybe suggest to you about where U.S. oversight for digital assets might be headed? What question does that raise for you personally about what could come next?
Definitely something to think about. And thanks for sharing this source and joining us for this deep dive today.